Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for inviting me here to talk to you about this project, what makes a good free farrowing sow. So a bit of background is that we know that close confinement of expectant sows has significant welfare impacts. It's very well researched, both physical and behavioural restriction, not only for the sow, but also increasingly for the piglets. And there is pressure to abolish permanent crating, ramped up pressure for sure from the successful European Citizens Initiative End the Cage Age campaign, which was heard by the European Commission a couple of years ago, leading to them tabling a proposal that they would propose phasing out caging of all species named in the ECI. And there is free farrowing systems are seen as high welfare alternatives to the farrowing crate, and there are lots of different options out there, varying in sort of quality and research behind them. But there's certainly increased interest and uptake of alternatives as well. But there are concerns, and some of them are very valid. There are economic concerns, managerial concerns, because it would take a lot of training to move away from permanent crating. And there are still concerns about piglet mortality. So the reason, well, one of the main reasons the farrowing crate was first introduced back in the 1960s was to reduce piglet mortality, particularly overlaying by the sow. But actually, a lot of farmers have worked with some of these systems already, and what they're really concerned about is consistency of performance. So they'll get a good batch of pigs that perform very well, and then they'll get a batch that perform quite poorly. And that sort of loses confidence and loses, there's less uptake because of that confidence. So how can we achieve consistent performance? Well, we need to optimize the 3 Ps, which are pen design, pig selection, and people. There's been a lot of work on pen design. There's increasingly, and there needs to be a lot more on the management and helping the people care for the pigs. But today I'm going to concentrate on the middle P, which is optimizing pig selection. And this project was looking particularly at maternal behaviour, how the sow moves around her piglets, whether she shows risky behaviour or good lying behaviour. But also for an indoor free farrowing situation, she does need to be very calm, calmness obviously with her piglets, which is sort of innate to a certain extent, but also her responsiveness to the humans, because there's a lot closer quarters there. In terms of the project objectives, there was an umbrella project a few years ago funded by Sainsbury's that we worked on called Free Sow, which looked to identify the characteristics of a successful free farrowing sow and how we might select for that. So it was a much larger project. And what AWF funding has enabled us to do is revisit that data, clean and collate it a bit more, do additional video analysis and more in-depth data exploration, because it was quite a valuable data set and write-up. In terms of the background of what we were working on, I do have to tell you about that initial project. We were working on 3 farms, commercial farms, and we collected data from over 3,200 sows. This gives you an overview of the different farms. They all had free farrowing systems. There were 3 farms with 4 different systems. Each had their own system. You can see the numbers that we collected. It's by litter, by sow. We did performance data, behaviour. The first farm had sort of quite a basic designed pen, if you like. Second one was the largest, system B was the largest. And then on this last farm, farm C, they had a temporary crate situation here, the 360 farrow, which is the same footprint as a farrowing crate in its open position. And for our studies, we did have it in the open position. And they also had operated these old-fashioned kennel and run, so quite a narrow nest, and then the sows have access to a kennel outside. So did the piglets. That's quite an old-fashioned system. They all still did operate the farrowing crates, and that's what they were used to, but we didn't do any comparisons with the farrowing crates, but it's just to let you know that the sows and the staff, they swapped between these systems. In terms of data collection and collation, we looked at performance, so key performance indicators would be mortality, litter size, numbers born, causes of mortality as well, and numbers weaned. We looked at physical characteristics, but we concentrated on behaviour. So we had CCTV footage above focal pens, and we watched those for 24 hours continuously around farrowing, looking at posture changes and farrowing kinetics. On a subset, and looking at calmness around the piglets. On a subset of sows, we looked at temperament tests on prepubertal sows, repeated tests 6 weeks apart to see whether there was consistency in how they responded to certain challenges, and then to see whether those matched up with certain farrowing behaviours. So if we can identify these sows early on before they enter the breeding herd. And I'll have to just give you a sort of small insight into this second study. Various statistical analyses have been performed as well. So the results, so this is not an atypical graph, if you like. So this is combining all of the data from the farms of over almost 3,200 sows. You can see that it's a litter species, so it's not unusual to get piglet mortality. So this is not an unusual graph. We have total born, total weaned, percentage total mortality, which includes the stillbirth and live births, and then live born and stillborn. What you would see differently compared to indoor farrowing crates is the type of mortality that the piglets are dying from. So in these studies, it's not unusual that actually those piglets that did die were dying because they were being crushed by the sow. Under farrowing crates, it doesn't completely prevent crushing, but it does reduce it, but you'd have a bigger stillbirth and a bigger number of piglets that were starved. So we want to concentrate on those pigs that crush, but actually more importantly, on a positive note, those ones that didn't. And this graph shows you the distribution of pigs that crushed no piglets at all, that crushed one, and for a litter species, one is still, it's difficult to say, but it's still positive because you do expect a certain number of piglets, unfortunately, to die before weaning in a litter species. And then you have all these ones in red that were crushing over 2. The positive note is that the majority of our typical pink pigs can do the job. So over 50% crushed less than 2 piglets. And you can see the absolute numbers here as well. There are various sources of variation. There is a significant influence of farrowing system. So we have the systems here, and we have the same typical graph. And we can see there's a real range from 45% that could do the job on farm A and C, and closer to 72% when we get onto farm B and D. When we extrapolate that to the overall key performance indicators, again, we have a big systems effect here, particularly on farm A. And what I want to point out to you is, yes, they did have the highest mortality, but they also had the highest litter size. And when we plot litter size against total deaths, we get this relationship. The bigger the litters, the more you get piglet mortality. This is a well-known relationship, and it's probably the biggest threat, actually, to free farrowing situations. When you have larger litters, you have decreased birth weight, you have increased vulnerability of the piglets, you increase farrowing duration, so you increase dystocia, and there's just more staff interventions when you have lots of little piglets to deal with, and that's quite challenging in any situation, but particularly under free farrowing. You also have a situation, another thing that explains the source of variation is parity. So the older the sows are, the more likely they are to give you a greater number of stillbirths. You actually see this in most farrowing systems. They have larger litters of smaller and poorer quality piglets. They have a higher body condition score and a subfunctional udder morphology. So you've got a big udder and little piglets. They also tend to have poor leg health and mobility, so that's a real issue when it comes to any environment, but certainly free farrowing. So what was the difference between the ones that sort of crushed in green, the ones that didn't crush in green, crushed only 1 in orange, and crushed more than 2 in red? Well, we looked at their behaviour, so their posture changes, their restlessness, their speed of lying, their pre-lying behaviour, so how much they interacted with their piglets to get them out of this sort of danger zone around them before they lay down. And then we compared those kind of categories of pig. The first thing is that, again, litter size was highly influential. So crushers, I'm going to call them crushers, had significantly larger litters than those that crushed 0 or 1. There was no significant difference in pre-lying index, that's that behaviour before they lie down, and there was no significant difference in the effectiveness of their pre-lying behaviour in clearing pigs, despite there being, it looking like there could be. Once you factor litter size and parity in, you lose the significance there. What we did see is that crushers tended to be faster during their lying events. When we looked at restlessness, we found that non-crushers tended to change posture less than crushers, so it's all sort of quite sensible results. But also non-crushers showed a greater time interval between their lying events. So they were calmer, they were spending more time laterally lying, which is what we want, so that safe udder access for the piglets. 2 minutes. I'm going to whistle through these just last 3 results. When we look at crushing, we also look at the various instances and how they might get crushed. Just to say it's not all fatal, there can be some non-fatal stepping of piglets. What we did find is that there were a higher number of overall instances in the crushers, but importantly, this is the most damaging one, stand to lying. That's when they're standing up to lying down. That was a problem. But there was, again, an effect of system, so it's not all the sow's fault. She actually does try to get out of the way, but when you have narrow systems, which is what we had on C and D here, we think that this is having an impact on the crushing instance, certainly, and particularly in Farm C. Very briefly on temperament, I can't go through all of this, but we did various behavioural tests on these young animals, so startle response tests and things like that. And just to say that the behavioural responses that showed the most consistency between test runs, so likely to be temperament traits that we might be able to select for, were actually handling scores, so exit order from the pen, ease of removal, their response to a startle, which was this bucket test, and also their response to humans. So there was some consistency in how they behaved. A subset of those animals then went on to free farrow, and we compared their farrowing behaviour with their temperament scores, and we found that those that were later in the exit order and more difficult to handle were related to their farrowing duration and stillbirths. So we think there's possibly something to do with fearfulness and how they perform during farrowing. So our conclusion so far, and I realise it was a whistle-stop tour, was that I think the positive message is that our commercial pigs can perform well in free farrowing. They can do the job, but you've got to give them the tools to help them. So the farm system is significant, and also if we continue to have hyper-prolific or super-prolific sows, we have significant challenges because the sow and the piglets are sharing the space, and it's very tricky for them. There are behavioural markers to identify good mothers, and there does seem to be some relationship between pre-pubertal responses to handling and farrowing behaviour later on. I'd just like to thank the Animal Welfare Foundation, the original funders and the participating farms, and those hard-working individuals that took the data on the farm as well, and our stats team. Thanks very much for your time.
That was brilliant, Emma. Thanks so much. We do have a few minutes just for perhaps a couple of questions, if anybody has any. And as ever, do feel free to use Slido. There's one for the roving mic at the front.
Forgive me if I missed it, but does experience make a difference? So these were first time.
Yeah, they were multiple parities, and yes, it absolutely makes a difference. So the temperament tests were obviously the gilts, the first-time mothers, but we did other studies to show that experience does matter. So actually, consistency is key. So if they farrowed in one environment for their first litter and the same environment, they performed better. If they switched, it was more challenging. It was particularly challenging if they went from a temporary crate situation, which we also looked at, but not for this study, into a free farrowing situation. And it's also incredibly challenging for the staff. So the staff switching and the farm switching, the sow switching is very challenging. So there is a transition period needed to get used to it.
Thank you. And there's one here. What was the direction of relationships between temperament and farrowing behaviour?
Okay, so yeah, sorry, I really glossed over that. But what we found was the ones that were more, well, hopefully I answered this correctly, but the ones that were more fearful in their response, so they startled more, they were the ones that exited the pen later, so they didn't really want to be handled. They were the ones that struggled more with their farrowing behaviour. They had a longer farrowing duration and a greater instance of stillbirth. We're still looking at those data, but that actually Paul Hemsworth's group in Australia found a similar thing. So fearfulness and farrowing behaviour. There's likely to be an impact of kind of environment and environmental stresses that will be affecting that as well as her temperament.
Thank you. Another hand in the middle, please.
Hello. Are there any studies looking at how the sows were in a completely sort of in a field, with those sort of completely free farrowing systems?
Yes, outdoor. Yeah, actually, I sort of did my PhD on the outdoor girls. So, there's 40% of our herd in the UK is outdoor, and there's not that many studies because it's just quite challenging to collect the data out there. But we tend to have a different genotype in the outdoor, so that maternally they have amazing behaviour, if you like. They tend to return pretty much the same average results as the indoor systems. But you can't, bringing in those outdoor girls indoors doesn't do very well because there's a G/E, a genetics by environment interaction. I think they need certain stimuli and triggers to be good mothers, and then the disturbance factor when they come in actually makes them hyper-reactive, so hyper-responsive indoors, which can be a real problem because they're kind of up and down and not as chilled out, if you like, with outdoors. So the outdoor farming's been done for a long time, and we have a well-established genetic line there, but we have to do something slightly different when we come indoors.
And we'll take just one last quick one, and just a quick response, if you don't mind, please, Emma. Were the squashed piglets weighed or examined for other problems?
Yes, again, sorry to present it briefly, but we did post-mortems on a subset, and then the farmers were trained as well, and we had technical staff there. So we were looking, with crushing, it can quite often be the ultimate cause of death, and hypothermia and starvation and crushing complexes there. But the ones that were crushed, it was deemed that it was due to crushing, if you like. The ones that were low viability, so the growth retarded ones and things like that, they were registered as low viability. And we did have, when you break down those mortality types by farm and by farms that had high litter size, we have larger proportion of those low viability piglets.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Can we thank Emma Baxter, please?